In Critical Thinking Part 1, I defined inductive reasoning as the use of evidence to support a claim, thinking inductively from all the specific bits of evidence. We induce an overall conclusion to take shape. In other words, the evidence of fingerprints can prove a subject was at the scene of the crime, and this small specific truth points to the larger conclusion of guilt. I should note that if you have not yet watched Part 1, you should go back and start there. Before we move into deductive reasoning, we need to learn a bit more about inductive reasoning. If I use evidence, how do I know it is valid? There are a number of things to consider. Is the evidence clear and easy to understand? If it isn't, why would you put it in front of somebody? Is it up to date? Now, obviously, if you're making an argument about, say, COVID vaccinations, you probably want to use something that's been published within the past couple months, not from 3 years ago. Is it by a reliable, objective source? Now, this is important. I recommend doing a little research if you're using evidence from online. Find out who the company is that's produced the publication or website. You can do just a simple Google query where you ask, is such and such company biased, and see what you find out. A lot of times if you just go on Wikipedia and look up the organization that's published the information, you will find out who owns that source and if they have any agenda or axe to grind. And do other people respect this source as being an authority? Is it pretty universally quoted and respected? Is the evidence specifically relevant to the claim that you're making? You want to make sure not to go too far afield from what it is you're trying to prove. And most importantly are these last two bullets. Is it accurate? And one way to find out if something you want to use in your argument is accurate, if you have the time and you're doing, say, like a research paper, is see if you can corroborate the information from some additional sources. And finally, is it persuasive overall? You know, when people hear this information or see this evidence, is it apt to change their minds? Moving on, by contrast, deductive reasoning works in the other direction. We start with a general, agreed upon truth, and from it we deduce what might be true in a particular case. For example, one thing on which we all agree is that if something is true, its opposite must also be true. We can apply this deductive line of reasoning to a claim about exercise. Exercising your body is good for your health. Thus, the opposite must also be true. Not exercising your body is bad for your health. So to make a deduction, there are 3 steps which we call a syllogism. First, there's a major premise, which is simply just a large truth that we all accept, such as all humans are mortal. There's a minor premise. Just think of that as a smaller truth that we can also accept. Socrates was a man, for example. And a conclusion or proposition. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. Now let's apply the structure of a syllogism to a claim made about human climate change. We'll start with the line of reasoning called cause and effect. In cause and effect, if a cause is present, its effect must also be present. So that's the overarching law of reasoning, the major premise in this case. The minor premise is that we are putting excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and this gas traps the sun's heat beneath it. The conclusion is, therefore, our excess carbon dioxide emissions are creating a greenhouse effect on Earth. The problem with this structure is that during the heat of an argument, It makes staking out a claim too complicated. Therefore, Aristotle, who literally wrote the book on rhetoric, suggested shortening the structure to just 2 steps, usually just the last 2 steps. Socrates was a man, therefore he was mortal. The shortened 2-step version of deductive reasoning is called a line of reasoning. The Greek word for this is enthymeme. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle, in his book The Rhetoric, identified 28 enthymemes. Some of them are used to make an argument, others are used to rebut or defend against an argument. We've already covered cause and effect, so we'll skip to the second bullet, which is one of my favorites, known as a fortiori. What is true in the lesser case must be true in the greater case, and vice versa. For example, if a little bit of exercise is good for your health, then a lot of exercise must be very good for your health. Third bullet, if considerations are the same, what was true before remains true. And then kind of turning that on its head, if circumstances have changed, expectations should change. That's just a law of logic. You can turn an accuser's words against the accuser. In other words, why point out the splinter in my eye if you ignore the plank sticking out of your eye? You can define a term differently from how the opponent uses it. So this is something Aristotle calls contradiction. So you can take something they've called you and turn it into something good. You can divide the range of possibilities beyond the single possibility put forth by the opponent. You can base a current case upon a previous judgment. And this is a line of reasoning that's used in case law and statutory law. You can ask the accuser to supply particulars to support his charge. You can consider whether something is good or bad for you. Consider whether you should be induced to do it or deterred from doing it. If smoking is bad for you, then you shouldn't do it. That's just logical. Sorry. Now let's take a look at deductive reasoning in action. A person says, the fear of global warming is a liberal hoax. The Earth's climate has changed in the past, even without human pollution. Notice that in the response, the person who uses the cause and effect line of reason first takes a moment to dignify the part of his opponent's claim that actually bears some truth. He says, yeah, it's true that the Earth's climate is known to change, but humans are accelerating the rate of warming with their pollution. The fact is, carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere trap the sun's heat, just like the glass in a greenhouse. Therefore, our pollution is creating a greenhouse effect. So it's always a good idea to bring someone along to look for any kind of point in what they're saying that you can agree with before you hit them with the whammy of your logic. Unfortunately, many times a person will make an argument that sounds logical on the surface, but on closer inspection fails the logic test. When a person uses false lines of reasoning, we say she has committed a fallacy. A fallacy will render an argument invalid. Now, literally hundreds and hundreds of fallacies have been identified. Here are some of the most common fallacies. First, a sweeping generalization. A certain amount of generalization, we have to admit, does help us to navigate our lives. But if a generalization is hurtful or unfair, it is bad. For example, if a person were to say, I would not hire a teenager, they are way too flaky and unreliable. This is certainly not true of all teenagers. And let's face it, it could be damaging or hurtful to say that about the entire group. A false analogy compares two things that do not have enough in common. For example, a person says, why should I have to do schoolwork at night? My dad's a plumber, and he doesn't fix people's pipes at night. Yeah, but honestly, there isn't very much in common between a student and a plumber. I mean, they're both human beings, and they both have work to do, but there are a lot of differences that aren't really being accounted for in that analogy. Another famous, very oft-seen fallacy is post hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates from the Latin into English as after this, therefore because of this. And what this is basically cause-effect reasoning gone bad. It's, okay, we see an effect, so we're saying a particular cause might exist, but the problem is here is that there could actually be more causes that are not being considered. For example, my wife put a new house plant in our house last night, and this morning the cat was dead. Clearly that plant is putting off toxic fumes. Well, actually maybe the cat died because it ate poison outside, or maybe it's having kidney failure, or maybe just old age. We don't know. So a weasel word is a word slipped into a claim that actually does not provide the authority it seems to have at first glance. For example, if an advertisement were to say, "This cleanser will virtually restore your tile to brand new condition." Okay, well the key word there is virtually. What does that actually mean? Finally, one last one just to hit before we wrap things up. Let's talk about begging the question, or making what's called a logical assumption. And this is a structural fallacy, where if you work backward in the syllogism from the claim's conclusion to locate either a major or a minor premise, there is none. So it's a statement or proposition that's really just based on no previously accepted truth. It's just begs the question, okay, well, what are you basing that on? So an example of that would be the statement, "Hermina is great with animals. She would make a great mother someday." Well, thinking back from that claim, where's the syllogism? What are we basing that on? How is working great with animals in any way a premise upon which we could base the claim that she would make a great mother? Here in part 2 of critical thinking, we reviewed inductive reasoning and also learned how to test our evidence to see if it's any good. We then went right into the counterpart, deductive reasoning, which is much more difficult, but much more fail-proof in an argument. There's really no way to undermine a well-founded deductive argument. We've learned the basic structure of deductive arguments called the syllogism, with the shortened version being called the enthymeme. And we've learned that the best way to think critically is by considering the logic of a claim, whether our own or someone else's, and how effectively it employs evidence or a line of reasoning to support itself. Or does the claim stand upon a hollow shell of fallacies and lack lines of reasoning? If it has even used evidence, is the evidence valid? In part 3, we'll talk about the reasons for knowing how to think critically and why sometimes trying to persuade someone we have to abandon logic altogether. Part 3 will be about the ethics of critical thinking and why persuasion is sometimes a matter of life and death, literally.